Fahrenheit 451, directed by Francois Truffaut, was released in 1966. This film, based on Ray Bradbury's novel of the same name, was not only Truffaut's first film in color, but also his first and only film in English. However, these new concerns for the director were quickly overshadowed by even bigger budget concerns, trouble with casting, and most notably infighting between Truffaut and Oscar Werner, who played the part of Montag. Truffaut had been toying with the idea of making Fahrenheit 451 since at least 1960, and he had ultimately turned down directing Bonnie and Clyde in 1962, saying, "Of all the screenplays I have turned down in the past 5 years, Bonnie and Clyde is by far the best." Over the next 4 years, his infatuation with this film seems to have become a love and then an obligation he felt he could not escape. According to his journal, Truffaut said that towards the end of filming, the fighting with Oscar Werner had grown so bad he would have left had he not already spent 6 years of his life working on the film. Werner was far from Truffaut's original choice. In fact, Truffaut had gone through at least half a dozen considerations before hastily settling on Werner, whom he had worked with before in Jules and Jim, a film from 1962. Some of the casting suggestions were from the union he was working with, and others were from Truffaut himself. The most notable two were Paul Newman and Terence Stamp. Newman removed himself after reading the first screenplay, stating that he felt the story needed to be more political. Stamp, however, removed himself after the dual casting decision of Julie Christie. Terence Stamp and Julie Christie were former lovers, which may have contributed to Stamp's refusal of the part. However, his stated reasoning was that he would be overshadowed with Christie playing both female roles opposite him. There are conflicting accounts of who originally had the idea to cast Julie Christie in both roles. However, the idea only came after a very long list of other options. This list included Jane Fonda, as well as Christie's immediate predecessors Tippi Hedren and Jean Seberg. Unfortunately, Alfred Hitchcock stated that Hedren was not available to work with Truffaut, and Seberg was not considered a big enough star by the studio, so the decision was made to use Christie in both parts. There were also some suggestions, however, that the decision to cast Christie as both Linda and Clarice was because Truffaut had become so smitten with Christie. He wrote in his journal how they hit it off immediately, and the language he used when describing her in his journal always seemed to be a little bit more than positive. He even wrote in one entry about how nice the size of her head was compared to Werner's large head, and how he had to shoot Werner's head from further away. Already mired in problems long before shooting began, the film only seemed to run into more issues as it progressed. In fact, Truffaut was quoted as saying it was the saddest and most difficult experience of his life. He was unable to speak with a large part of the people working on the film since he had only taken a crash course in English for 6 weeks prior to the start of filming. Most of his crew was also unable to speak French, and he was forced to do his work through the assistants who he also used as translators. The fighting had quickly escalated with Werner as well. Werner's refusals to act the part in the way that Truffaut had imagined left Truffaut trying to create his vision in the editing room, with the help of an editor who he couldn't communicate with, again due to the language barrier. The issues between the two often led to shots like this one, where you can see Montag putting on the fire suit is simply the shot of him taking it off shown in reverse. Also, in this shot, Truffaut noted his displeasure with Werner's smirking arrogance toward Clarice.
Oh, really, your uncle is right. You are light in the head.
The fighting between the two was also presumably the reason Werner had his hair cut at a regular barbershop much too short as they were shooting the final scenes. Werner had had the use of a hairstylist in the studio and had kept his hair the same length during the entire production. However, he insisted the haircut was accidental and that he had simply fallen asleep in the chair and had it cut too short before he awoke. Various people involved in the production, however, attributed it to Werner wanting to cause a continuity error out of spite. All of the fighting between Werner and Truffaut, the difficulties in casting, budgetary concerns, as well as the language barrier, culminated in a film riddled with problems. The film certainly has its supporters. Martin Scorsese stated in his biography that it has influenced much of his filmmaking. However, most critics seem to agree that the film falls flat. It is missing something crucial and plagued with bad acting. The acting can almost certainly be attributed to the problems in production. However, various critics have given various reasons for the movie's failure to have the same impact as Bradbury's novel. In my opinion, the main aspect that is missing is the central theme of living without living. Truffaut's disdain towards science fiction of his time meant he wanted to film this picture absent of as much of the novel's futuristic elements as possible. There was no green bullet to communicate with the Professor Faber, who was himself absent from this picture. The electric-eyed snake was shown, but never mentioned as anything other than standard medical fare. And most notably, there was no electric hound. In Bradbury's novel, the beast is described as living but not living. It, along with many other elements in this narrative, exists in a pseudo-life. The people are zombies who have enveloped themselves in things that appear alive but aren't.
But never that other way.
Truffaut does attempt to force
Anyway,
this
that's
theme.
life,
He even has Montag
That's what you
state the
call it.
idea explicitly.
You're nothing but zombies, all of you.
Also, at the end, we see the book people enveloped in nature as opposed to the drugs and television of everyone else. They are surrounded by real life and not the pseudo-life of this warped society. Unfortunately, Truffaut's strengths seem to cause his main problem with this film. He was known as having an excellent knack for mixing retro and new in his pictures. This type of design left Fahrenheit 451 with excellently designed interiors. The home of Montag and Linda is beige, neutral, and lifeless, while in contrast, the home of the old lady is warm, used, and lived in. His vision of a futuristic TV set is so accurate it looks like most living rooms of today. However, this accuracy means we don't look at this slightly large television set as anything oppressive. In Bradbury's novel, the wall screens literally covered the entire wall. In fact, Linda's parlor had 3 walls covered. She was basically encased in a womb of television. The outside shots, however, are where Truffaut truly loses the key theme. These houses are surrounded by normal life. There are almost as many trees in these neighborhoods as we see in the forest of the book people. If Truffaut had kept the shops similar to what we see at the beginning, the stark lifelessness of this society might have begun to emerge. The absence of the electric hound may have been even more powerful. I would like to simply attribute the metal beast's absence to the technical difficulties of creating such a thing on film. Obviously, the special effects Truffaut was able to produce were, well, you can see for yourself. However, Truffaut's dislike of science fiction was more likely the reason he created a place that doesn't seem all that bad other than having no books. From his journal, he wrote the following quote: "When one is navigating in the waters of science fiction, one is sacrificing verisimilitude and psychology, which is not a serious matter if one makes up in plausibility and lyrical feeling what one loses by being out of tune and reality." Truffaut certainly achieved this goal in Fahrenheit 451. Unfortunately, by doing so, he has lost a key aspect of what made the story powerful and relevant. He's given us a society that is normal, except they burn books, and probably do too many drugs. This is not at all like the powerfully flawed society Bradbury gave us in his novel. The film's production problems were obviously its largest hurdle. However, Truffaut seems to have given himself another by removing any of the science fiction elements he could. He was too concerned with giving a world life when the exact message of the story was that the world was devoid of life. Ultimately, Truffaut made a reasonable adaptation, but one that falls very short of Bradbury's work.